I want to connect us to our first panel, which is nonprofit changemakers. So I'll turn it over to my colleague, Lana Cook from Open Learning. Take it away, Lana.
Wonderful. Thank you, George. And so exciting to hear about the GOI and to be a part of it. My name is Dr. Lana Cook. I'm Assistant Director of Strategic Initiatives here at MIT Open Learning, where I incubate new and emerging work across the education space with a focus on workforce development for emerging talent. I have the good fortune of working very closely with the MIT Refugee Action Hub, REACT, which is exactly in this space, and I think I'm so excited to talk today with all of our esteemed panelists on nonprofit changemakers, because it is those spaces, between education institutions, companies, and industries who make those linkages to how do we bridge the education to employment pathways for vulnerable and marginalized communities, for those who, need that extra kind of lift in preparing for the workforce. Today, we'll hear from 3 speakers who will really explore how they're innovating in this nonprofit space to advance workforce education and help diverse communities advance the kinds of skills to help them thrive. And so I'm pleased to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Tana Wuliji, who has led the establishment of the World Health Organization Academy between 2018 and 2021. The Academy will support 10 million people by 2023 with state-of-the-art lifelong learning to achieve health impact. And Tana, I'm really excited to hear about this work on this panel today. Tana's work has a deep vein of equity and health, and she's passionate about people. She's a health workforce expert, researcher, and policy advisor, and has led large-scale international programs for over 16 years in 15 countries in Africa, Middle East, and Asia. Tana, I would love to hear about your work with the WHO Academy. Please tell us about your work.
Thank you so much, Lana, and thank you to everybody here. I'm really excited to be here and to share the story and also to learn from others. I think George set the right tone in challenging us to think about how we can come up with solutions and thinking about the wicked challenge. And here's the thing, I think we're all in the same boat. We're all facing the same challenge. How do we use learning as a tool to achieve our goals, which are really quite common at the end of the day? In the area that I work, it's about health. How do we get the labor force in health to access the learning so that they can make the changes that we know are going to improve health for all? And here's the sticky bit. We're in a tough situation because, as George said, we've got to think about it from a workforce perspective. So just a little bit of context before I get into the story. So the context is this. We've got about 130 million health workers around the world. Of those, about 65 million health professionals. And there are around 350 million people who work in health. So it's a really broad group. And it's one of the fastest growing employment sectors. And it's also the sector that employs the most women. So 70% of the workforce are actually made up of women. So it's a sector with huge opportunities and yet huge challenges too. There's a shortage of 10 million health workers by 2030, especially in Africa and the Middle East. Well, what's learning got to do with it, you might ask? Well, a lot. We know that the science in health is doubling every 3 months, and we know that the things that we got to do to support people around the world has to be based on evidence. So this guidance is constantly evolving. So imagine a scenario that new guidance is coming up, new science is emerging. We know better and better ways of how we can support people to improve their health or to save their lives. And yet we're not getting it on the ground. It's not being implemented. And the fact is that the science is showing us it's taking sometimes 10 or more years to implement what we know works. So the gap between what we know and what we're doing is growing. Learning is got to be part of the solution. And while this is a huge effort in the health sector and we're putting a lot of resources towards it, it needs to change. Learning is not a new area for WHO. We've always done that as part of our constitution. But I think looking at the workforce dynamics, looking at the pressing need to accelerate, we realized that we need to step up the game. So our Director General, Dr. Tedros, had the idea of building a school for the future that could serve this need. And what does that mean? Fundamentally, it's a transformation effort. It's changing the way we learn, reverse engineering for the change we want. And we're very clear in WHO about the changes we want to see that are going to support health for all. And so that means that if change is the goal, then competencies has to be the target for our learning efforts. And if we look at the kind of competencies someone needs to get the job done to improve health, that's what we want to focus on. And if learning is competency-based, we've got to throw away this notion that people's work comprises of rote learning and rote repetition of facts, because that is not anybody's job in reality. And so if people's job is about decision-making, autonomy, judgment, working collaboratively with others, then the learning experiences have to scaffold and support that. So that meant we changed the goalpost from knowledge to really competency, and then using the sciences that have to accompany that to achieve competency-based learning. That means the learning we've been designing in the academy and the learning models is very much based on practice, proficiency towards specific performance, evidenced by behaviors of interest. And this also means that we have to understand the context in which people are learning and working so that we can design learning that is really going to meet their needs. Imagine having a situation where you have the perfect program, but the health worker is extremely busy. They barely get a break. We've seen how this has happened in the context of COVID. You're not going to get your solution delivered or achieving the results it could. And that was the other thing for us. It was really important to be able to personalize so that even if the health workers in the basement of the hospital has 15 minutes, but no mobile connectivity, they can still do the learning they need to do to improve their performance. The other thing that's really important for us is not just personalization based on the learner's context and their setting, but really being able to look at how well they're learning and being able to adjust the learning for that reality. This allows the learning to be more streamlined, more in the flow of what they're doing, and is commensurate with the background of experience they have, which we know is different for each person. Another really key thing here was how do we recognize this competency-based learning? A lot of learning in health is really based on certificates and completion. And yet we know at the end of the day, it only really matters if you're able to do the thing that you weren't able to do before. So recognition required us to embark on a journey to look at digital credentials and learn from others, especially the tech and other work going on in higher education. And we've taken on the best from the industry and best practice to design a digital credential approach, which is competency-based. And we've really, learned with and worked with ILO and UNESCO and others in this field, as well as regulators across health, over 50 regulators, to design the basis of a set of standards for digital credentialing. Another challenge here is access. So even though we've got all these health workers, around a quarter of these health workers don't have reliable access or connectivity on a routine basis. And so even if we have the best digital solutions, we're not going to be able to deliver them. That means we've got to adjust our approach, work with partners on the ground, as well as provide flexibility for offline, online learning, assessment, etc. And the other thing here I want to emphasize is things that are going to structurally change the frontier. So we've also invested in innovations such as open source approaches for learning experience platform, new technologies for competency-based multilingual learning. So not just mono languages, but different languages happening together, and how we can use AI and human translation to aid and support that, including the assessments, which is really complex. And a new frontier is also how we bring that new edge to immersive learning through simulation learning, gamification, serious education games, and real-time collaboration across different parts of the world or even within a country for joint learning exercises. I'll pause there and look forward to discussing further. Thank you.
Fantastic, Tana, and so many of the themes that you hit on between, the gap between what we know and then do, that implementation, and how, WHO is working on, reverse engineering for the future that we want, and how that really means both changing that goalpost, as you said, from knowledge to competency, but really truly meeting learners where they are across geography, across access, language, time. And I think these are some of the kind of key things that we're going to get into in this panel discussion. So next, I'd love to welcome Charles Baldwell. Charlie is an enterprise development specialist for the International Labour Organization, ILO, for their decent work technical support team. His work has centered on creating sustainable approaches for linking job creation and job quality through support to large factories, business associations, national governments, and the informal economy. And I think really represents a kind of systemic approach that is the focus here in the GOI. Before joining the ILO, he worked at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, where he's assistant to the chief of staff, as well as at Schlumberger, Bayer, and IBM. He studied at Stanford and Cambridge, really focusing his doctoral research on geographically dispersed teamwork. Charlie, I would love to learn more about the work that you're doing with the ILO and how you're, advancing this space of upskilling for international communities.
Thank you, Lana, first of all. And I'd like to say congratulations to George for his movement that he's getting off the ground today. We've been talking about it for some years, so it's great to see this coming to fruition. When we look at programs for enterprise development, skills development within companies, for me, what I always look at is programs that are sustainable, scalable, impactful, and that fit the partners that we're developing. It doesn't make any sense for us to run a program that doesn't continue after we're done. Doesn't make any sense when you're talking about the informal economy to work with handfuls of people. You really need to reach many people. You want to see that it actually does what you're looking for, and if it doesn't fit, it's not going to be sustainable. So it has to fit what the partners want to do. When we look at those factors, and what we found with time is that a primary driver is the cost and capacity of the programs we promote. Do they fit the cost or the resources available by the organizations we're supporting? And do they require a level of capacity that the organizations have? Typically, what we often found was we're providing very expensive programs that are for high capacity organizations. And the fact is the organizations are relatively low capacitated and don't have many funds. Traditional training approaches requiring experts to be able to go into companies and provide them expertise takes a lot of time, takes high level people. So we looked around and tried to find something that said, okay, how about if we don't have teachers? What if we don't have trainers? What if we don't have conference rooms with PowerPoint projectors and everything else? And we came across a program run by UNESCO, in fact, in Tamil Nadu that was purely based on activity-based learning, getting rid of the process of developing capacity over months or even years of local partners, purely peer-to-peer learning. And I've got to say that we've become kind of a one-trick pony in terms of many of our programs in Asia based on this. We started with working with the informal economy, providing training to people in remote areas, no teachers, no trainers, just local partners that had lightly trained people on how the program works, sitting people in groups and having them learn from each other. Worked really well. So we went on and worked with refugees, and in particular, refugee youth that were unaccompanied and made it all the way to Indonesia. Put together a kind of mini MBA with the University of Michigan and put the kids through that. Extremely low cost, extremely easy, and very impactful for the kids. Then we kept hearing about the interest in soft skills. The companies are saying, talk to the head of production globally for Seagate, and he said, you know what, we don't need people technically trained as much as we do need people that can think. And we need people that are better able to think on their feet, to work together, to have those soft skills. What do you have to offer in that regard? Again, we worked with the University of Michigan and put together a program, 14 different modules on things like problem solving, team building, communication, working upwards, starting to manage. And we've run that now with a range of different companies, with IBM, Seagate, Nestle, Samsung. Training their women workers was the initial target, generous support of JP Morgan. They wanted to see us do support for women workers. We did that. We've just had the results of the program, and we saw 10% increases in productivity through the program. But more than that, what we heard from the managers were this kind of approach, having peer-to-peer learning instead of somebody in the front of the room, which reinforces the traditional Asia approach to education, where the teacher talks and the students write, to one where people really engage and get to speak up. What they saw were real changes in the practices within the companies. So we're now going on, just to wrap up, we're now going on to looking at global supply chains. We're working with some big companies and their suppliers in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Ethiopia, Vietnam, on how to upgrade their supplier factories. We put together 80 training modules on different aspects of how to run a factory, good practices, and good labor practices. So that's where we're going. We don't think we have the answer with this, but it is one of the answers, and it's worked for us so far. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Charles. And I think that also is an excellent note. You have one of the answers, maybe not all of the answers, but that's, why we need convenings like these. So they can explore across those dimensions, as you said, of fit, of sustainability, of scale, so that we really are designing programs that can both be locally contextualized to meet the individual workers where they are, but also really reach the kind of the need, which, as George highlighted in his slides, is quite massive. So thank you. So now I'm delighted to welcome MIT colleague here, Peter Hurst. Peter is Senior Associate Dean at the MIT Sloan School of Management, where he leads a team of professionals to partner with clients and faculty to design, develop, and deliver innovative and impactful executive education programs for individuals and companies. His over 20 years of experience in international strategy, technology consulting, and organization leadership and development. His past roles have included CEO of Commercialization Consulting and Executive Ed at the London School of Economics, Senior Science and Technology Policy Officer and Westminster Fellow in the UK Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, where he advised MPs and peers of all parties on policy issues in the physical sciences, defense, IT, and entrepreneurship. Peter, I'd love to learn more about the work that you're doing at MIT Sloan in executive education in upskilling both, here residentially on campus, but really reaching, executives, managers, really around the world through Sloan's executive education programs.
Thanks very much, Lana. And, it's just been fantastic hearing these two examples from Charles and Tana of the work that you're all doing. And I was sitting here suffering in some ways from a phenomenon which we know has a big impact in the world of sort of access and mobility in employment, with some version of imposter syndrome, thinking, gosh, how can I contribute to the collective wisdom compared to the examples that we've just been hearing. And I was just reflecting on perhaps, what was it? Why did George invite me here to participate in this? And I suppose part of it, Lana, as you just described, is I think we are somewhat have been at the forefront in our industry in the non-degree executive education space, which is my team at the Sloan School, and in many ways, for a long time before the latest iteration of sort of big changes in how to think about and execute on learning. In this case, for organizations and for individuals, and to that extent, we were pioneers in the executive education and leadership education space of using sort of the approaches to action learning and applied learning, which are very core to for a long time at MIT, but bringing that into the executive education industry and space, and more recently, the digital transformation of our industry. Again, we were, I think, early adopters and early experimenters with things that put us into good stead when COVID came along, and we were in a pretty good, strong position to be able to pivot very quickly to continue to offer our learning and our programs to people who really needed them. And what are those needs? I listening to everything that was just talked about, and to George's excellent introduction. The theme which really resonated for me and is very core to how we think about what we do is really the ever accelerating pace of change, and how we really need to prepare people to be able to not only stay on that curve, which is growing exponentially. And in the old days, you could wait a little bit before you had to reskill and upskill, and it was the same size step to catch up to the next to that next development. But the problem with these, or the challenge with these exponential curves, is that the longer you wait, the further behind you get, and that's true for organizations and it's true for individuals. And so I think we spend a lot of time focusing on how do we help individuals and how do we help organizations really come to terms with this, with being in this state of continuous change, and it manifests at all levels. I was just looking at somebody's resume today that used to work with us, and was struck by the fact they're now in a quite senior, responsible position, but they've changed jobs, roles, and essentially industries every 2 years for the last 15 years to get into quite a senior position. That's a very different trajectory. I was looking at some data on our participants who come to our non-degree programs at MIT Sloan, and there have been some cycles here. If we go back a long time, this was all paid for by employers. And then there was a period in history when the pendulum swung, and it was much more individuals trying to develop themselves. And then it swung back towards employers with essentially custom programs, the kinds of things that you were hearing Tana and Charles describing, where employers were creating programs to develop their workforce of the future. What we've seen in the last couple of years, interestingly, has been a real swing back towards individuals investing in their own learning and development. They haven't been getting what they need from their employers, or they haven't been looking at the prospect of a lifetime with a single employer. And so in some cases, those that can have been investing in their own time and their own resources in trying to develop themselves. And of course, that's, that opens up a big question, because a lot of people don't have access to what it takes to be able to do that, or in many cases they don't even have the awareness of what's available to them. And so that's one of the things I think we have as a great challenge, and it's a big struggle as well. We try to engage with a variety of this initiative from that George has set up is another fantastic opportunity for us to do this, because we really need to hear from the stakeholders. We need to partner with the stakeholders, whether they're individuals or with companies, and other kinds of organizations, to understand what are the needs and how can we help really fill those. We've been involved with an organization called the Internet of Things Talent Consortium for the last half a dozen years, which is focused on one very particular aspect of this that George was touching on. How does digital technology changing what employers need, and how do employers and academia and other stakeholders really respond to and get ahead of that particular change curve. And one thing that we learned in that, which I think was a very interesting and surprising discovery, and again, I think Charles just mentioned this and Tana did as well, it's less about the technical skills oftentimes, it's about how do we get organizations and leaders in organizations to understand what employers and other organizations and the role of government and other stakeholders are. What kind of leadership skills and capabilities do we need to see being developed and deployed, and how can we help with that? And that changed our awareness a lot. And so we've been really focusing on questions like that. Of course, again, I'm in the executive education space, but it does spill over. And another organization, again, super interested to hear the references to Africa, where we try to find organizations to engage with that are at the front end of trying to solve these problems in a real way. So Self-Help Africa is a charity that we've got involved with, and we've opened up spaces in our executive education courses to field workers from that organization and their clients. It's an organization that's helping try to create employment and jobs and vibrant economies in rural Africa by transforming from subsistence agriculture into sustainable, sort of vibrant economic systems that enable people to create wealth and sustain improvements in their quality of life and create educational opportunities for their families and children. So, that seems like a stretch. How do I get from executive education to helping farmers in Africa? But I think that's the kind of connection that we all need to be thinking about. How do we find those connections and use the resources and the influence and the capabilities that we have to be part of those kinds of solutions. So I'm thrilled to be in company with such fantastic leaders as there are, not only on this panel, but I see in the chat and in the conference as well. And I look forward to this discussion, but also to finding out from all of you, how how can we in executive education at MIT Sloan do more than we have been doing to help with this very important issue?
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. And I'd love to pull on that thread, and I think it was really throughout each of your presentation or your discussions around that pace of change, and that this pace of change demands new structures and systems for designing, delivering, distributing education. And so I'd love to hear from you all about, why are our kind of traditional approaches to education no longer serving the workforce? And why must we switch our approach in reaching those learners, especially those who are in danger of being left behind by this tremendous pace of change? And so what opportunities do you see in leveraging different learning modalities to meet learners where they are, whether that's on the talent or on the company side?
Yeah, I think, I really can resonate, I really resonate very strongly with what Peter said. And I think it's a good point about, it's about relevance at the end of the day, and this changing dynamic context that we're in. And the question really is, has learning become more flexible, or have we become more entrenched and rigid to say we've become very attached to certain processes of learning that border on the ritualistic and not really on the outcomes? And so if we wed ourselves to the outcomes, we open up the sphere of possibilities and the range of motion to support the learners in a better way. And it's about power. I think it's the dynamic, as Peter was speaking to, and also Charles, about the dynamic between the learner and the one who's supporting learning, and really putting that on a more level field to see this is a partnership, this is a dance we have to do together. For us in the health space, as I was saying about that shift to competency-based learning, it has meant trying to let go of some of the rituals in the process of learning and being more flexible about the outcome of learning and the different ways to which you could get to that outcome. Because someone may definitely need a very intensive facilitated course of learning to get to that outcome, and another person may not. And another person can do that in a very self-directed, peer-managed way. And all ways are fine as long as the outcome is achieved. And there's such hang-ups around recognition of prior learning and what is learning, what is not learning. And at the end of the day, we really just want the person to be able to demonstrate that they have learned and they can do something that is required of them. I think the other thing here is really understanding behavioral science as a key ingredient to learning. And there's so much fixation of how we can support memorization and recollection of facts, and the way that the primary and secondary school systems are often engineered, reinforce that, and we go through that again in workplace learning. And so for us, I think it's really about unlearning and releasing the process and focusing on performance and how we get there. The other thing I wanted to say is that, with traditional approaches, it's not that we throw the baby out of the bathwater, the baby out with the bathwater. There are some times when that's really called for, but we have to analyze. I think we're missing a step between this is what we need and this is what we're going to deliver, but really analyzing what kind of competencies are implicated here and how do we get to them, and seeing what blend of what we do now and how we do it differently could make a difference.
I think that's a really great point, especially about how do we know where we can be having the impact and what we need to be doing, and who should we be talking to, and more importantly, who should we be listening to? Again, at the risk of getting myself into trouble, slightly anecdotally, when we work with companies in the executive education space, so we're talking about mid-career and more senior managers, but I would say time and again we find the people that we really need to be engaging with in that are the people who are in the front line of the business, who actually understand what they need. And the further we get away from that, the less impact that we have, frankly. And there's a self-criticism, I think, involved in this as well, because in many ways, all of us who are educators and sort of or in sort of the human capital space more broadly, we have to remember to really find ways to get close to the people that really need to apply the learning, at the coalface, as it were. The more abstract we get, the further away we get from that. I think the less valuable and less impactful we are. And this pace of change is really a big issue here then, because think about traditional academia. How long does it take to come up with the need, to identify the need for and create a master's degree program, let's say, or an undergraduate program in some new emergent space? That's years, maybe even decades. How long do we actually need to do that in? Months, maybe even weeks in some cases. Think about what happened with COVID or what's going on in the world at the moment in a variety of fronts. And so we need a very different way of discovering where the needs are and being able to respond to them than has been the tradition in our industry.
Yeah, just to fully agree with my fellow panelists, but I feel like the guy that was in the commercial that says, I'm not only the owner of the company, I'm a customer. I've got 4 kids in school, and I see the expensive international schools, top quality, and you can see that some teachers get it and some don't. Sometimes traditional education works quite well because they know how to help the kids click, and sometimes they don't. And I think with training methodologies, we have to look at them and say what is effective and what's not. There's some things the baby with the bathwater can't be thrown out. We've got too many systems out there, too many vocational training centers and other programs that need to be developed. And I think we've got a lot to learn about how and to spread what we know down through systems, so that people that they're going to be an educator, they're going to be a trainer. How do you do that better? And there are ways. And there's people that, the difference between a really good trainer and a mediocre one in terms of outputs is huge. So that's just following the traditional. Meanwhile, we got to keep looking at the new ways, the new tools. What else beyond our usual get people together and train them? What else can be done? So we've been quite interested in some of the online training approaches, the self-learning. We've been partnering with Google on developing micro lessons that people, young people, how do they learn? My kids, they learn with this. They sit there and coming up with micro lessons that they can do in 10 minutes through a whole series of topics. So trying to find things that fit the different communities is what we're going to be looking at.
Yeah, and I saw Michelle in the chat just said it takes 2 years to get a new course accredited in Ireland. You're not alone, Michelle. That's pretty universal. That might even be quite fast compared to some places. Yeah, that's one aspect of the challenge that's big. I think that maybe other panels will come on to talk about this, but I really was thinking as you were talking about. Now we're all talking about the Great Resignation, and maybe what we need to be talking about is the Great Re-signing. How do we get people, back in? And I am not sure that all of this talk about sort of a talent shortage is really hitting the nail on the head. It seems to me that it's a mismatch of how do we connect the people and the opportunities and make sure that they've got the skills and capabilities that they need to be able to take advantage of them. I think talking about a talent shortage sort of suggests that we don't have the human capital that we need, and that just to me just doesn't ring true. It's much more of a matching issue, and what Charles was just mentioning, there are solutions to so many of these things that are already out there. And I think an opportunity, but also a great frustration, is we all know about examples. Tana and Charles are talking about 2 fantastic sets, but how do we actually get those out into to being scaled and applied? There are so many great experiments that happen, and we just don't seem to see them getting traction and getting universally applied. And I see places like in San Diego, High Tech High, fantastic experiment in schooling. I would love to have one of those in my community for children in my community, but you don't see them being reproduced. So I think fora like these are great for that. But for me, that's really the great challenge. It's not that we don't know what a lot of the solutions are. It's that we have not been able to get those solutions really understood and adopted into practice. And how do we do that?
I think that perhaps touches on my next question, which is really around how do we build out this ecosystem? So GOI is creating this convening space across companies, entrepreneurs, nonprofits, educational institutions, learners themselves. What advice or recommendations would you give to companies, startups, entrepreneurs who are entering into this space, and particularly around, why nonprofits need to be at those tables. And I'll add, as we were talking here on this panel, why learners themselves need to be at these tables. Perhaps, what advice would we give? And perhaps where have we seen either in other industries, good examples of that kind of ecosystem building where it's been successful in those kinds of partnerships, either in your own work or that you've seen elsewhere?
Yeah, I think my advice would be to lean into the discomfort. I think part of the problem with the traditional approaches, the systems and structures support the continuation of them. And we've become very comfortable and we've become accepting of things that we should not be accepting. And so I think leaning into the discomfort is really important, because that means we have to listen. We have to recognize that there's a need to change. Otherwise, why change? Change is a disruptive process. It changes the incentives around why we do things and how we do things. And for many people, it may make their jobs different or even redundant. And so it can also be perceived as threatening. So leaning into the discomfort means that we have to work together, because we're not going to have the solutions alone, and not together in the traditional sense either. It's really about working across sectors. And I think this is where nonprofits and multilaterals can really play a role, because we sit on quite a lot of data about where the issues and the problems are, where the pain points are, where things are not working, and can provide objective analysis on this. And I think we also have the networks and the convening power to bring stakeholders like governments, and ILO, of course, the other stakeholders like employers and workers together to find solutions and to find different ways of addressing structural issues in the labor market and around education. One thing I think we also, I'm not sure that I have advice, but I really put it out as a plea, is to invite people into the process. I think we're often nervous or afraid to invite people into a change process. We want to figure it out first, and then we're going to reveal it later, just sort of do a big unveiling. But I would really encourage opening up and being humble and listening to others. And in fact, for us in our journey, one of the first things we did was, when France decided to invest in the Academy, which was absolutely core, was to reach out to leading thinkers, movers and shakers around the world. And that included people like George and Vijay and others who helped us through the early stages and helped us to invite others who could really get us out of our comfort zone and to embrace different ways of doing things.
I would say institutional resistance to change is extremely strong. We've been working on change management for decades within the programs that I'm responsible for, and it is really tough. A couple of secrets is, as Tana was just touching on, you need to have people involved. The people that are going to be affected by a change need to be engaged in that process, I think. And that, is one example. And I think in particular, when you work with companies, if you can get top management on board, whether that's a factory manager, whether it's a head of production for a company or a global, whatever it happens to be, HRD, it makes it a heck of a lot easier. We, as one example, in our programs on soft skills, we got Seagate on board because the executive vice president played football. His son played football with my son. And we chatted. And he said, that sounds really interesting. Next thing you know, Seagate in 1 year trained 15,000 women workers, their whole workforce in Thailand, by one person. So if you get top management, top government officials, it's the same thing when we work with governments to get them buying off on whatever you're pushing. And for that, evidence is really important. Having the numbers, having the proof, having the case studies, and the things that back you up. I think in terms of global change, this kind of initiative like GOI, I think it's quite important that we have forums where we can sit and talk and share and push this kind of idea out, whatever it is that we think works, to be able to share it with others.
Yeah, I mentioned in my remarks the Internet of Things Talent Consortium, which I've been involved with. And one of the companies that drives that, Rockwell Automation, in collaboration with Cisco, Microsoft, others, and governments and other organizations, has been really creating some very impressive kind of initiatives. To Charles's point, they'll tell you that it's taken them years of relentless effort to actually find educational institutions that will engage with them and really designing curriculum that these employers are saying that they need, and being able to deliver that in ways that learners can actually use. So yeah, this is a long, hard change process. And again, that was very interesting for me, as I do, coming from this executive education and leadership and management perspective, which this is where we've actually got the skills gap. We've got the skills gap in our own leadership and our own leadership capabilities to be able to envision this future and manage this change. And if we can't do that, we're not going to be able to do all of the things that we actually need to do to solve the problems that we're trying to solve here.
Fantastic. I'm going to get to one of our audience questions and actually maybe collapse two of them. So Janelle is asking around soft skills, of employers are very skilled at training very specific job skills, often in the kind of technical space, but they count on academic programs to teach soft skills like how to think or problem solve, but that, how do we perhaps, make this kind of soft skills training, or human skills, as we say at MIT, more accessible for people who are in the workforce, so not necessarily requiring going back to four-year degree programs. And there's a related kind of question here about how do we ensure the academic value of digital credentials? Because I think maybe perhaps some of our easier answers is in the digital credential space, but particularly in Tanya, I'm thinking about your work around competency-based education. How do we help workers demonstrate those, upskill in these soft skills and demonstrate them to employers in ways that employers really, recognize?
Thanks very much. As you said, it's really situational, right? Because how you demonstrate soft skills in one context may be very different in another context. And certainly for the emergency room doctor, how they would demonstrate behavior around, a serious life-threatening crisis may be very different to what they do at the point of interviewing a patient who's still, awake and alert. So I think that's the thing that we focus on in the academy, that when we think about the change that we want to support and the kind of behaviors that the health workers need to demonstrate, we're trying to unpack with some precision what sort of behaviors we're exactly looking for and in what context, because that's the thing that matters. And so the learning process really supporting them to be able to practice those things. For us in health, it's very rare that you have one worker who can deliver an outcome completely on their own. They are so interdependent with others. And so the soft skills we're looking for are really being able to work with others, communicate with others. And in fact, every single competency we have includes those as elements. And those are part of the assessment. That is part of the evidence that has to be in the transcript for the credential, for example, the learning record. One thing that's also really important is, we haven't talked about it yet, but really learning in the flow of work and how we can use work as an opportunity to learn and demonstrate and build evidence of learning. And that's something we also look at. For us, it's unrealistic that you expect to pull out a health worker for a year or two, take them somewhere off-site and bring them back in. That does happen, but by and large, they're learning on the job. And so how we can actually support and do that more effectively. One of the things I think is a real issue is how the learner gets feedback. And I would say micro feedback as they're learning, because you're building a soft skill, you're trying it out for the first time. Maybe it's different to how you'd normally do it. How do you know if it's right or you're going in the right direction? The way we assess people sometimes is sort of, the cup at the bottom of the waterfall. It's a little too late. And so if there are opportunities to get feedback and tweak and adjust and iterate, that is very natural. That's very normal for self-directed learning as well. And it's also more efficient. We know the evidence around that. So I think, for us, we have to think about how we build in exactly as Charles was saying, peer learning as a mechanism for getting feedback along the learning journey, and then ways in which we could support people to learn together as much as possible as a realistic simulation of real work. And I think in that way, that package presented to employers and managers is far more compelling and convincing, because it is situational and outcomes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tana. So as we're drawing to a close of this panel, but I think really we're just highlighting some themes that are going to continue throughout our discussion today, and we're excited to get to our next panels. I wanted to ask each of you just a closing question. So, we've talked here about some of the really key challenges, the need for the systemic response, and yet how there's a great, sometimes institutional resistance to change and to these kinds of disruptive processes. But I want to end on a note of hope. So as you look at the field of workforce education, what inspires you? What gives you hope today? let's start with Peter.
Sure. I think that as challenging and tragic as it's been in many ways, if you look at the ways that so many organizations and individuals have sort of pivoted in the last sort of 2 years, and we've shown that we can do it. I think many of us in 2 weeks did what was going to take 20 years. And so that gives me cause for more optimism than I usually have about our ability to really to drive this kind of change when we wake up and realize that we have to do it and we feel like we have no choice. And maybe that's not quite such a good news thing. Is there are things that are driving our need at the moment that will become very great tragedies if we don't respond to them. And so that maybe not quite so optimistic, but my cause for optimism is we've shown ourselves that we can do this, even though it's been messy and imperfect in many ways. We know we can do it.
Charlie.
Yeah, well, Peter just took my answer. I think what I've seen in the last couple of years in terms of the change, even within my own organization, which is not a fast changing, the ILO is deliberative, consultative, and we have had to just move forward at light speed to be able to adopt to what happened in 2020. And we did. Programs went online, new methods were developed. We had to adopt dramatically fast, and a lot of people did it. My optimism comes from, I think people just do it because they have to. This is the new market. There will be a need for new skills, for you to worry about your own skills much more than you did in the past, and people will do it, and some won't, and they're going to lose out. So our goal is really to help those that need help, and to see as many people as possible be able to succeed and develop and have the skills they need for the future.
I think what really gives me hope is people. I think people are more concerned about questions of equity and fairness and progress than ever before. We have more means, more tools, more evidence, more options and possibilities to connect and cross-pollinate than ever before. And we know what can be done. And so I think even though progress is uneven, the fact that there is progress in some sectors really gives us a lot to learn from in other sectors. I know that in health, we've looked to aviation and tech and how they've been revolutionizing learning and adopting some of those lessons within health. And I know that others look at health as well. So I'm very optimistic because I think even with a small group of the willing, we can actually move a lot, and more people are keen for change. And that's exactly what we need right now.
Wonderful. And I am inspired by the people here today who, leaders like you who are innovating within this space and the community we have convened here. So thank you all for just such an enriching, engaging discussion. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg of the day. So I thank you all again, and I'm going to lead us off now into a nice 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for the corporate approach to career development panel. So thank you, and see you all real soon.